oftentimes garment workers are paid by the piece, not by an hourly wage. Okay. And many in the industry have fought to get this corrected. Even here in the United States, there are factories here in the United States that are and were paying per piece. So, for instance, if you are assigned as a worker to put tags on the back of shirts, you're not paid, minimum wage to do that. You're paid by each tag that you put on a shirt. So literally, if you're being paid 3 cents, 5 cents a tag, you have to do thousands of tags a week just to come out with a couple of $100. Welcome back. Welcome back. This is the People's Voice. I am Trey Evans, and I am the People's Voice. Thank you again for checking out the podcast this week. As always, it is greatly appreciated. As always, we thank everyone who is listening to the podcast and taking some time out of the day to check out the podcast. We understand that you can be using your time to do something else, so we appreciate the attention and the time that you have given to listen to the podcast today. As always, if this information is enlightening and you feel like it is worth sharing, we do ask that you please share this information. You can also subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe on any podcast platform and share the information as you see fit. Thank you. Today, I want to cover import, not just imports, but I want to talk about America's dependence on imports, specifically in the apparel market. And I want to talk about this because, well, for a couple of reasons. There's been a lot of conversation in, I guess, the last few months regarding China and U.S. relations, right? And, I always find it so interesting when I'm scanning through some of these news stories and catch some of these news programs where you've got these government officials, and I'm using air quotes for you guys who are not who are listening, not watching the videos, these government officials talking about the strained relations between China and America. And, I always find it interesting that the relationships are strained, but business continues to keep going, right? Because, in business and in life, I should say, especially when you're dealing in capitalist societies, money trumps all things. But because of that, it made me want to do a little bit of research and look into America's dependence on imports, and specifically in the apparel market, because, many people may or may not know that a lot of the clothing and items that you purchase are not made here in America, especially from the apparel standpoint. And so I wanted to talk about that today, kind of go through some of the numbers in terms of what is and what is not produced here in the United States, what those numbers look like in terms of the wages that are being paid to many workers who work on these items that many of us wear, and then talk about some of the reasons for it and, what the future holds. This is a tough one in terms of trying to pinpoint a solution, because this is a huge, huge task. But I do want to kind of hit on some of the intricacies of why this is happening, and kind of, again, to provide information that hopefully that can be shared among those that in the community. And maybe if we can address this as a collective, we can get some information. I mean, we can get some movement in terms of trying to correct some of these challenges. Now, I know from a business standpoint, well, first of all, okay, number one, why do we import so many of our apparel goods? And again, I'm talking about apparel. We import and we export a lot of things, but apparel is the one I wanted to talk about today. So number one, why do we do that? Well, bottom line, it's about profit, right? It is about being able to produce an item for a small amount and selling it for a higher amount, right? We call that profit. So it's not, it doesn't require a deep understanding. It doesn't require an MBA or some type of, business degree. It's very simple. Produce it low, sell it high, make money. So that's why it's done. Now, when did it start? Doing some of the research, you really saw an uptick in terms of imports of apparel goods starting in the early 80s. And then as you get through the 90s, when you have the NAFTA agreement, the National American the National American Free Trade Agreement, that was implemented in 1994, which basically released a lot of the restrictions on imports, because there used to be many restrictions on how much or what could be imported into the country. That changed in 1994 with with the signing or the agreement of NAFTA. Because of that, you saw a lot of companies beginning to move their product productions off of the United States or out of the United States, and then started to make those connections with employers and factories in other countries. So let me kind of give a history of that, just a brief history, so we could all understand, get on the same page, and then I'm going to, talk a little bit more about this as I move forward. So I was reading an article here from kqed.org, and they did a piece on this that, I thought it was a great article. And basically, what they covered was kind of where we used to be in terms of a country, in terms of the amount of apparel that was purchased here in the United States, and then where we eventually have gotten to. So it says here in the article that in 1960, an average American household spent a little bit over 10% of its income on clothing and shoes. Now, the equivalent to that today would, represent something like, almost $4,000 compared to, what was being paid for back then in 1960. The interesting thing that from that stat is that as of today, we actually spend less. Okay. We spend less money per year. This is on average on clothing, but we buy more clothing than we did back in 1960. So in 1960, the average household spent about purchased about 25 pieces, 25 garments, or 25 pieces of apparel per year. Now we're well into, 80, 70, 80, 85 pieces or 85 garments a year. But we spend less now than we did in 1960. Now the average household income spends about $1,400 a year on clothing. And that only really represents about 2% of most household income. So we're spending less on clothing and apparel, but we're buying more. And this is where we get into imports. We're buying more because we're able, as a country, well, first of all, it's being produced at a much lower rate, right? Some of the arguments that, many people have heard is that if you make it in the United States, it's going to be too expensive and people can't afford it. So they outsource a lot of the production for this to other countries. They make it at a cheaper rate. They can mass produce it, and then they bring it back here and still sell it for a considerable profit. So that's what I kind of want to talk about in terms of our dependence on importing and where we're at in terms of paying wages, or I should say not us paying wages, but the wages that are paid to a lot of these countries that create these products for us and then send them over here back to the American designers to be sold to the American public. So I kind of wanted to just give a background, if you would, so you kind of understand some of the metrics, excuse me, of where we're at now in terms of what we purchase in terms of clothing, compared to where we were at, and some of the reasons why that change has occurred. Now, in terms of the wages that are being charged, or I should say the wages that are being paid to workers. So a lot of the apparel, and again, I'm focusing on the apparel imports today. A lot of the apparel imports, or apparel, I should say, clothing that comes to the United States is created. And when I say created, I should change that, because I know somebody's listening and say, what was created? A lot of the production, right? The actual production of those garments, of that apparel, is done in countries outside of the United States. Matter of fact, I read a stat and it said only about 3%, I think it's like 2.8% of apparel is made here in the United States. So basically 97% of the world's apparel, 97% of clothes that are worn by American citizens are made outside of the United States. But I wanted to talk about the wages. So these clothes are made outside of the United States. The majority of these countries that are making these clothes, the workers, where they live, typically are in countries where the cost of living, or I should say the poverty line, is extremely, extremely high. They are usually poorer countries that have less infrastructure, countries that have less opportunity. So often the job that is available is working in a factory to produce these garments. So what are these countries? Well, going through the list here, and I pulled up, a statistic here from Statista. This is from Statista.com, and I'm reading the average monthly basic wage of garment workers in selected Asian countries. Now, they chose Asian countries between March 2020 and March 2021. So the average monthly wage for a worker in Indonesia, again, this is garment workers, okay? I'm talking about workers who produce the clothing that is then sent here to the United States. In Indonesia, the average garment worker makes about $243 per month. I'm stopping for effect. $243 per month. In Cambodia, you have $190 per month. And again, I'm giving these totals in US dollars. I'm not going to read through the whole list here, but to round out, you have India, you have Sri Lanka, you also have Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. These are the countries that a lot of the apparel comes from. Now, yes, a lot of the items that are produced, that are sold here in the United States do come from China as well. But if you look at a lot of the apparel, and yeah, I'm one of those people that when I'm in the store, I'm looking at the tags to see where it was produced. And a lot of these countries that I just went through is typically where you'll see made by on the tags. So 200, I'm just going to focus on Indonesia for a second. $243, and that's literally the highest that's listed here. Now, on average, when it talks about from a global standpoint, basically on average, or all the countries that were listed here, it's basically rounds out to about $200 per month. But so Indonesia, $243 per month. Okay. So now, clearly here in the United States, I believe average household income is around $62,000, if I'm correct. Right. So just doing some simple math here. And as you can hear the calculator, I'm calculating it as I'm talking to you guys. So $243 per month comes out to $2,900 a year, right? Literally $2,900 a year. So, as I said to you earlier, as of today, the average American spends about $1,400 per month. $1,400 per year on clothing. Whereas the average worker in Sri Lanka only makes $2,900. So basically, half of what is spent on apparel and clothing in the United States per household is half of the salary for a worker in Indonesia for the entire year. Right? And that's a cause for a lot of concern. So why is that? Well, as I explained to you before, from a production standpoint, these countries pay a much lower wage because the argument is that the living conditions don't require the wages that we as American citizens require. But also it is because of the way that the individual garment workers are paid. Oftentimes, garment workers are paid by the piece, not by an hourly wage. Okay. And many in the industry have fought to get this corrected. Even here in the United States, there are factories here in the United States that are and were paying per piece. So, for instance, if you are assigned as a worker to put tags on the back of shirts, you're not paid, minimum wage to do that. You're paid by each tag that you put on a shirt. So literally, if you're being paid 3 cents, 5 cents a tag, you have to do thousands of tags a week just to come out with a couple of $100. Matter of fact, let me play this clip from a advocate in California, because again, like I mentioned earlier, only 3%, about 3% of the garments that are produced, or I should say 3% of the garments that are worn and sold here in the United States are produced by American companies. But in California, there's an advocate that has been fighting to get the wage structure changed because, again, like I said, people are being paid on a per piece basis as opposed to an hourly wage. So I want you to hear what she said, and then we'll go from there. So let me just play this, and then I'll continue from there because it's quite interesting what she had to say.
When a worker provides their labor, and is not provided the local minimum wage, or is not provided the overtime rate for their extra hours, or is not provided extra pay for the meal break they were made to work through, we consider that a theft of labor. Unfortunately, in the garment industry, um, both in the US and around the world, it's very common for workers' wages to be stolen from them. They're simply not paid the full extent of the legal wages that they're owed. You
And this is that was a piece from CNBC. But as you heard the advocate speak there, they are being paid by the piece, and not only are they being paid by the piece, but they are also being forced to work through meal breaks. They're also being forced to work beyond 12 hour 8 hours. I mean, a lot of times they're working 12-hour days, but again, because they're being paid by the piece is what's contributing to the low wages in this industry. Now, again, going back to where I started, I know the arguments, and many arguments have been made. One of the arguments that has been made is that the cost is defendable, or I should say, the wages are defended. Many people have defended the wages because they say that the cost of paying American workers to do this is too expensive, which would then fall back on the American citizen in terms of what should be paid. But there should still be a fair wage, in my opinion, that should be paid. I read one stat where it talked about that the average CEO for many of these companies, and now here's an interesting fact if you want some information. 20 brands basically control over 97% of the industry profits, I should say, from apparel. 20 brands basically control 97% of the profits here in the United States in terms of what is sold in terms of apparel. But going back to some of the arguments, so some of the arguments are, okay, yes, we do pay a small amount to these companies that are in different areas of the country, but we still have a lot of costs that we have to cover, right? So for instance, a company will say, well, we pay workers in Cambodia or in Vietnam 10 cents a tag, and then we sell it here for it might cost $1 to produce the shirt over in Cambodia, but then we sell it here for $45. But a lot of companies and a lot of politicians have argued that there are other costs that are incurred by the American company, which can sometimes be able to justify what they pay for. A lot of times they talk about the design costs, because even though these countries are producing these garments, they're saying, and I'm just talking about some of the arguments, the other side of it, is that they're saying, well, there are costs that go into it. We have design costs, there's marketing costs, there's wholesaling costs, there's delivery costs. And that's all fine and well. But without the actual product itself, the product is the most valuable part of the equation. And so, you know, many, many people who defend importing from poorer countries will present this as an argument. But at the end of the day, there is clearly an unfair balance when it comes to compensation for garment workers. And in many cases around the world, many of these workers are women. So that goes into a whole nother conversation in terms of equal pay and fair pay, which is still in 2023 a major issue across the globe. But specifically in the garment and apparel markets, oftentimes you find women who are working in these jobs and are being paid these very minuscule wages that cannot support the families that they're trying to support with this. Matter of fact, just one more fact, during the pandemic, there were several companies here in the United States who defaulted on payments because once the pandemic hit, a lot of the orders that they had already requested and that were produced, they decided that they were not going to pay on them. Now, you know, again, I'm talking from both sides. There are going to be people that say, well, there is language in the agreements that talks about if there's a force majeure or if there's an act of God, things of that nature, we don't have to pay. But what the problem is that when these companies chose not to pay the outstanding orders, this has affected a lot of these workers that were getting paid these low salaries. Matter of fact, it's been reported that over 1 million workers in Indonesia were laid off because of this. And, you know, some people say it's just the cost of doing business. But again, when this happens, it's not just the cost of doing business. This means that one of these workers are not able to feed themselves or their family members, again, because they are so dependent on the salaries that are paid there, because literally they are paid by the piece. So when there is no work, there is no money. And it's a huge issue that I think needs more spotlight. It's been a lot of spotlight on this, but I believe it needs more spotlight. So that's what I want to talk about today. I wanted to talk about the apparel industry and America's dependence on the apparel industry. And so, you know, it almost like I want to say, what can we do? You know, there are always things that you can do, right? From an individual standpoint, you can be more conscious about, you know, what you're buying. You can seek out American-made products. You can also be an advocate to, like I am being today, to kind of raise the voices for equal or raised pay. A lot of advocates also are pushing for getting away from the paying structure of per piece and actually instituting an hourly wage and to increase the hourly wages. Now, obviously, we don't have, and I say we as an American citizen, we don't have control of how other governments choose to initiate their labor laws. But at the same time, we don't have to be so exploitative and take advantage of that. We can also, if we are serious as American citizens, being able to assist and to raise our voices to bring attention to this matter, so we can at least increase the pay for all of these garment workers, because across the board, the wages that are being paid is definitely minuscule, and then our dependence on these products, or I should say our desire to have these products, only fuels that and continues the cycle. So that is what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about America's dependence on imports and the wages that are being paid to many of these workers in these poorer countries around the world. So, as always, I do hope this information was enlightening. As always, I will put links to all of this information that I just researched in the description of the podcast, so you can check it out yourself. And as I ask, if you find this information enlightening and you want to leave a comment, you can reach me on socials. I am available at I am Trey Evans. That's on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And then you could also reach me at the People's Voice Podcast on Instagram, the People's Voice Podcast. So, as always, dreams are not just for sleeping. Please wake up and live your dreams. My name is Trey Evans, the People's Voice, tell somebody about the dream. Salute. People's voice.